go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, to the merits of giving and the other perfections. May I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, to the merits of giving and the other perfections. May I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, to the merits of giving and the other perfections. May I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. So in the text we just last week we finished the sort of brief presentation on the perfection of wisdom, and there's more to come on that topic. But now there's like another pretty brief section on another topic, so the idea is that we covered the 6 perfections, which Lama Tsongkhapa explains as mainly being, the way one causes oneself to progress along the path. And so, whereas by practicing the 6 perfections, one is sort of bring about one's own evolution towards enlightenment, towards Buddhahood. And that's interesting because sometimes people, I mentioned this before, of course, if you practice 6 perfections, it does benefit others, right? If you're ethical, it means you're not killing other people, for example, so it's helpful to others. But you're the main beneficiary of your own ethics, or generosity, and so on. So here, there's another section that's traditionally presented, which is the 4 means or 4 methods of benefiting others, or ripening others, he says. The 4 means of gathering disciples that ripen the continua of others. So he's saying this point that the 6 perfections mainly ripen while they do benefit others, they mainly serve to function to sort of ripen in the sense of if you have the seed of Buddhahood, right, Buddha, the tattva garbha, the sort of Buddha nature. By practicing 6 perfections, you cause that to ripen into Buddhahood. But these other 4 trainings, or 4 points, 4 trainings, are specifically done in order to effectively benefit others and lead them towards enlightenment. That's really the idea. And so he lists the 4. So the first is, I'll actually read what he says here. He says, generosity is the same. So here, what he's getting at is, the first of the 4 trainings is if you're trying to help others, is to be generous to them. So to give them what they need. And he makes it, he'll go into it more later. Then the second one is speaking pleasantly and teaching the Dharma to others, teaching especially the 6 perfections, but Dharma in general. The third is guiding others essentially towards positive conduct, towards actual practice. And the fourth is yourself practicing what you preach. In other words, putting into practice what you're trying to help others do. And then he quotes about that from the Ornament of Mahayana Sutras, which is a Sanskrit text originally by Maitreya. But so now he goes on to explain what these are. So and he makes a number of important points. So the first, really, what he's getting at here is, if you're how does a bodhisattva, right? There's this idea in a way that as a bodhisattva is sort of evolving towards Buddhahood, in a way, it's an important point, right? Buddhahood is not for oneself, right? Buddhahood by its very nature is to benefit others. And so part of what a bodhisattva has to do, or wants to do, or does on the process of progressing towards Buddhahood, first of all, is to benefit others, but particularly as the bodhisattva is sort of progressing through the stages towards enlightenment, they're gathering disciples, so he says, but it's more developing connections with others and helping others evolve as well, so that by the time the bodhisattva becomes a Buddha, those others, they'll have a connection with each other, and the Buddha will then be able to guide those beings to actual enlightenment, gain realizations. So it's sort of a process that happens, in one life it can happen to some degree, but also over lifetimes. So here it's describing how does a bodhisattva do that. So it's saying, well, first, in other words, if you're trying to sort of teach, they're making a point in general, right? If a being is sort of starving or in extreme distress, they're not going to have the ability to sort of feel calm enough to study. So providing them with a safe environment and with, that's like where this. I mean, this is what happens now, right? Like, so if you like, what's there to say, right? First of all, if you, like, there are two examples I give. One is creating, like in creating centers where people can go study, or monasteries or things like that. And then the other is, you see, like, actually, if you go to a monastery, when a young student comes, the teacher actually is responsible for them, oftentimes. So they're getting at that kind of thing too. Like, the person can't study properly. If a young monk, for example, can't study properly if they're starving, right? So the teacher will sort of provide them with their needs. In the West, it would be more also just having a place, right, to study and so on. So it'd be like, providing the environment, providing the situation. If there's a retreat, then providing the food, so people can practice. So then the second one is then explaining the Dharma in a pleasant way, right? So, whereas what they're getting at there is, being gentle, being kind, and explaining things clearly. So that, because if beings don't understand the Dharma, they won't be able to practice. Helping, and also like they make various points like answering questions and helping people overcome their doubts, and so having discussion. It's not just, part of what they're getting at here is it's not just formal Dharma lectures. It can also be sort of, if you're talking with a friend who's having like confusion about something and helping each other figure it out, that would be included in this if you're doing it with compassion. And this can also be included, not just a formal teaching, but like, just if you know somebody who's not interested in Buddhism and you're not trying to convert them or something like that, that's not the point, but giving them wise advice and helping them sort of figure out how to behave, and what's the correct thing to do, that's positive and wholesome and so on. That could also be an example of this. The second is explaining something to others. The third is helping them engage in the actual practice of it. Does that make sense? So like encouraging the person, or what's the word? Like, like there's a different sort of, almost like a formal. One is a little more formal, like sort of theoretical, and the other is sort of helping the person, either encouraging them or helping them understand how to sort of on a practical level engage in what they're doing. And sort of giving them sort of personal guidance, you could say like that. And then the fourth is to act in accordance with what you're telling other people, of course. So the idea there is, the opposite of hypocrisy. Right? Like, so putting into practice and setting a good example, and they say that, basically, like, if you're saying practice ethics and you're not being ethical, then what's it? People will be the opposite of inspired. What would that be? Feel it's just meaningless or something. Right? So putting into practice what you're suggesting others do, and embodying that for others. So that's the fourth of these four qualities that help others. And one more point I'll make. Here. Yeah, another point is that if you look at what those four are, they're not, what's the word? They're not contradictory to it. They're actually, you can include them in the six perfections, right? Like he makes a point there. He says, generosity is not different from the generosity of the perfection of generosity, but the difference is here it's very specific. Like perfection of generosity could be any sort, being generous to anyone. Whereas this generosity is specifically helping in the context of helping guide someone on the path. So like providing for them in a context where they're practicing or studying, if they're doing retreat or if they're attending classes or that sort of thing. And the other also, right, like speaking meaningfully and speaking pleasantly and explaining, that there is, if you think of morality, and also generosity, those are included in those, right? Like it's not, you can see ways of categorizing those, right? Like speaking pleasantly is not harsh speech, so that would not, it's a kind of ethics. But it's again in a specific context of guiding others. So that's the difference. It's not, the point being that these aren't separate from the six perfections, but they're sort of a specific focus of your practice that's sort of included within the six perfections, but that specifically benefit others. So that's sort of clarifying what that is. Then now Lama Tsongkhapa sort of summarizes. He says the summarized meaning. And he quotes Atisha saying, as for the bodhisattva conduct, it is the six vast perfections and so forth. The yogi arising from meditative equipoise, steadfast, accomplishes the path of accumulation. So, and then Lama Tsongkhapa goes on to explain that. And so here he's talking more generally about the six perfections, and he makes a number of points. One is, and it's interesting, he says, so the path of accumulation, by the way, is there are five, the bodhisattva as they progress to enlightenment goes through five paths. There's the path of accumulation, preparation, seeing, meditation, and no more learning. So he's describing here a bodhisattva on the first path. So somebody who's realized bodhicitta and is kind of early in their practice of becoming a Buddha. But he says, as the person progresses, first of all, he makes a point, he says, they never pass beyond the six perfections. So he's saying, at a certain point, the bodhisattva integrates the six perfections into their being so completely that all of their conduct is integrated into the six perfections. And that's a goal, right, as we're sort of getting started. The idea is that one would sort of, that one is never separated from ethics, for example, that one is always looking for opportunity to be generous and so on. But then he sort of goes into a detail here where he says, he makes a point, he says, as a bodhisattva progresses on the path, they develop deep meditative concentration, and they integrate that with the wisdom, understanding, emptiness. And then he says, he makes a point, he says, so when somebody's in this kind of, what he calls meditative equipoise, right, so they're in meditative equipoise on emptiness, what he says at that time, while they're in that kind of meditative equipoise, they can really only be practicing three of the perfections. Meditative concentration, wisdom, and effort. Right? They're making effort in order to meditate. They're in this meditative concentration, and it's on wisdom, so those three perfections are practiced at that time. But one is not, at that time, one is not actively sort of focusing on patience, for example. Or one is not actively focusing on generosity because one's mind is absorbed in the meditative state. And then so he says, he's saying for a bodhisattva, during that time, when they're in meditative equipoise, they're practicing those three perfections. Then when they arise from meditative equipoise and they go around in the world, they practice actually all six perfections, but they mainly focus on generosity, ethics, and patience. But they have to do so with joyful effort, and they have a certain degree of concentration in what they're doing, and they integrate wisdom into that. So in that sense, they're practicing all six perfections when they're in post-meditative state. And sometimes if you're reading Buddhist texts, actually, you'll see that it's funny, they integrate, they describe life, actually, as meditative equipoise and between sessions. So I think it's like basically that's one way of looking at what is life, right? So there's the time when you're in meditative equipoise, and then there's the time when you're between sessions of meditative equipoise. So during your meditative equipoise, you're meditating on, whatever, like emptiness, for example. And then what do you do between sessions, right? If you read like retreat manuals, it'll describe that. What do you do during the session? And then what do you do between sessions? So then, like, the lamas will say, well, that's your whole life, right? But then, of course, when Khenchen Rinpoche was teaching that, he started laughing, and he said, well, for a yogi who's in retreat, then that's like a kind of a, maybe it's like half their time is in meditative equipoise. He said, of course, he was kind of saying for you all, of course, like 99 point whatever percent of your time is between sessions, but it's still, it's still an accurate way to define life from the point of view of focusing on meditation, actually. And then he makes a couple more points. So I'll continue. He's quoting Atisha here. So Atisha says, whenever you arise from meditative equipoise, familiarize yourself with the view of all phenomena as equal to the 8 illustrations of illusions. Subsequently purify conceptions and give priority to the training and method. At the time of meditative equipoise, balance, calm abiding, and special insight, and familiarize with this continuously. So there he's making a couple points. One is, like a bodhisattva, when they're in meditative equipoise on emptiness, their mind is absorbed in this state of realizing emptiness. And then this is described in many texts, actually, is that in between sessions, if you realize emptiness, then you view, when you're after having meditated on emptiness, one views oneself and others and things, external things and internal states too, as illusion-like. Does that make sense? So And part of that is because ordinarily, when we perceive, say, another person, we perceive them as existing independently, or as existing intrinsically, existing inherently from their own side. But once you've realized emptiness, you know that that appearance is not true. In other words, that beings only exist as dependent originations, interdependently. And so you recognize that you still have, out of habit, you still have this appearance of things existing sort of in their own right. Like, so a chair seems like it's a chair in its own right, not dependent upon causes and conditions, not dependent on parts, not dependent on the mind imputing chair, right? Because it's not a, and those chairs don't go around saying, hey, I'm a chair. Like, we impute that onto the chair, like through our own labeling and so on. But we see the chair as just existing out there, as this independent sort of existing phenomena from its own side, as if it's actually just a chair, not fabric and so on, that we're labeling chair upon, right? And so for someone who's realized emptiness, they naturally have, but also cultivate this view that although things still appear to them as if they were existent in this sort of intrinsic from their own side, independent way, they recognize that appearance as illusion. Does that make sense? So things are described as illusion-like to them. It's not that they don't exist, but they recognize that the way they exist in them is illusion-like. Yeah.
So I debate with that particular concept, like when I see and then my mind says like it's illusion, but then sometimes I feel that I'm going into another mental trajectory, So how one should practice that? Because like we all realize that like we're continuously changing and that, but then we also don't want to get stuck in our head how to bring it down.
Yeah.
So
a couple of points, like because I remember asking Kensher Rinpoche about that, or I was there when somebody was asking, I can't remember which, but and he made a point. He said the first thing is, he said the main focus should be, in order to understand this illusion-like thing, he said the main focus has to be actually meditating on emptiness itself during the session. And he said, because if you haven't, he says, if you realize emptiness, not even, I mean, of course, if you realize it directly, the path of seeing, that's one thing, but even if you realize it in a kind of correct conceptual way in meditation, with, what's the word? Like, not directly, but indirectly, but through actual your own practice, then naturally things will appear as illusion-like to you. And you won't have to sort of, it'll be a natural way that you'll understand it sort of intuitively. And so, I mean, one point was, he said, so mostly focus, if you want to understand this point, he said, mostly just focus on understanding emptiness correctly and meditating on it, contemplating it, and so on. And then this other quality of illusion-like appearance will arise somewhat naturally. That was one point. And then the other point, though, is, it is important, though, like, so in other words, because if one just sort of cultivates that only, sort of walking around saying, oh, this is, without a correct understanding of emptiness, it won't be as effective. That was one point. But then there is a usefulness at times, particularly, like, in other words, I think, so take the example of a chair, like, unless you're actually meditating on emptiness, that's probably not going to be that useful, actually. I mean, that will happen naturally if you meditate effectively on emptiness, you'll see everything in that way. So that's quite good. But the time, I think, where this is useful in daily life, in particular, is when we are caught up, and particularly at a time where you're really caught up in sort of, like, what's the word? In some obsessive emotional reaction to something. So let's say, like, for example, if you're upset with somebody, right? And you think, oh, they did this terrible thing, and they're so bad, and I'm so mad at them, or something. At that time, sort of recognizing, stopping and saying, for example, this is like a dream. That's one of the illustrations. Whereas my mind is creating this appearance of them as so bad. That can be quite useful, right? Because it's some recognition that I'm adding something to the story, or to the, like, just this recognition that my own mind is creating this appearance, especially at times where we're feeling, if you're feeling very craving after something, like, oh, if only I had that, and, so it could be anger, whatever or craving, or some other strong sort of afflictive emotion. At that time, it can be very useful to stop and say, this is like a dream, or this is like an illusion, or this is like a hallucination, or something. because it will be effective in decreasing the intensity of the emotional response. But they say that it's but the main way to progress is not to just walk around repeatedly saying, "Oh, things are illusion-like." It's more to focus on the actual emptiness side, and then that will give rise to that experience. Is what Rinpoche said, which I thought was helpful. And then Lama Tsongkhapa makes another practical point also here, where he says, actually I'll read this line because I think he's making an important point. He says, after describing this state, right, where somebody's in meditative equipoise and they're going around, they see things as illusion-like, and they're continuously making effort in generosity and ethics, and they're sort of, their whole life is integrated into the practice of the six perfections. He says, if you hear about such wonderful conduct, so hard to do, due to the mind being untrained, it may produce anguish in your mind, right? So if as a beginner, if you hear of somebody who can if you hear, well, the ideal is that you would be in this meditative equipoise on emptiness, and then you would go around and you would only benefit others continuously, you may feel sort of anguish, like in the sense of almost like, what's the word? I can't do it. This feeling of it's so difficult because I'm not capable of that. And then he says, although even bodhisattvas are unable to practice it right from the start, if you come to understand it and acquaint yourself with it, down to being an object to be aspired for, later on you will come to naturally engage in it without depending upon effort. And so really he's getting at a psychological issue, right, an emotional issue that we could have, which is if you start to study what do bodhisattvas do, you could have what's the word, low self-esteem, basically. You could feel discouraged. And he's saying that's incorrect. And he's saying, first of all, even actual bodhisattvas at the beginning can't do what well-trained bodhisattvas can do. And so of course we can't do that at the beginning. But he makes a point, he says, so how do you progress, right? He's saying, so first, you have to come to some understanding, right? Well, what is actually a bodhisattva's conduct? And how does somebody progress on the path? If you don't understand that, then if you don't know where you're going, you can't go there, right? So he's saying, so come to some understanding of it. And then he says, then the next step is just to start aspiring to that. Like thinking, well, I want to do that. That would be beautiful. To live in a way where compassion and bodhicitta are integrated into each moment of my life, and to have the meditative experience of understanding the nature of reality, right, would be wonderful. And just to start to aspire to that, he says, is very powerful, right? That's what he says. He says it all begins first with understanding, and then with aspiring to that. And then he makes a point, right? He says, and then you have to start where you are, and you slowly start, and he uses this word over and over again, acquaint or familiarize. And he's saying, so then you just start doing a little bit, right? And then a little bit more. And then you just do it over and over again. And he makes a point, he says, then, if just by doing that, eventually it will all come without effort, right? So it takes effort to familiarize, but he's saying whatever you become familiar with will eventually become natural. And that's a very profound point, isn't it? Because also, when you're practicing, that can be very useful, right? So, because if you're just sitting there, for example, if you're just you could be I remember this, I think it was on the Zoom, she drew a picture of somebody who where he said something, and there was a picture, I think, and then he was explaining, he said, a person comes home from work, and they just lay down on the couch, and they meditate on love for all beings, right? And he was saying, because they're tired, right? But they're meditating, they're laying down, but they're thinking about love for all beings, and he's saying, well, they're familiarizing their mind with that, right? And that's what Lama Tsongkhapa is getting at, just by doing that, it becomes more and more familiar, and eventually that becomes normal to the person, and then it becomes natural, and it becomes effortless. And that's how bodhisattvas progress, is through familiarization. So each time I guess the point being this, one is, if you're feeling hopeless or discouraged, you can remember, all I have to do is, just familiarize myself with something, and then it'll become more natural, and that's how every bodhisattva progressed. That's one point. Another point is when you're actually doing that, you can kind of encourage yourself. Recognizing, okay, well, I'm actually doing it. This is the practice, this is the path. Does that make sense? Because sometimes we can feel it's some, I don't know, the path is some sort of very exalted, distant thing or something. And what he's saying here is, no, just if you're familiarizing your mind with ethics, right, and just think, and if let's say that's what you're doing in that moment, that's it. Like, right, and then that's how all bodhisattvas and all Buddhas progressed, is they, they had a situation where they could do something unethical, and they stopped and they said, oh, wait a second, I want to do the right ethical thing in this moment. And then they did that again and again, and it became natural because that was what they were habituated to. And that's what you're doing, right? So he's saying, so when you do that, one point is like, don't be discouraged, and the other point is when you're actually doing that, to sort of feel a sense of enthusiasm or joy that this is the practice. Does that make sense? And by habituating to that, that is how you progress, and that's how all bodhisattvas progress, and that's how the Buddha progressed. And he says, so he goes on to say, that is why familiarization is important. For if you see it as impossible to actually engage in them and discard even familiarizing yourself with the training in them, you will be extremely far from the completely pure paths, right? So he's saying as long as you keep hope and keep a sense of, okay, well, I can gradually familiarize with something, you'll naturally progress. But if you become hopeless and just think, oh, it's too hard to familiarize with this simple training, then you'll never get to those more exalted trainings. If you do familiarize with these, those will come about naturally. And actually one of the implications of this, right, which I just want to point out, is dependent origination, right? We actually sometimes feel like things, because we feel that things exist independently, if we're not there now, it could feel like you could never get there. What he's saying is everything arises dependently, right, dependent on causes and conditions. So if you do the practice now, other things will naturally result from that. It'll be a natural evolution. Does that make sense? And then I'll just read the last two lines of this one quote. He says, those practices will become natural through familiarization over time. Henceforth, it is hard without familiarity to increase positive qualities. And, this is also, so one is everything arises dependently. Another point is like, whatever we do habitually comes about easily. Does that make sense? Like, and so like, I've said this kind of thing before, like, like there are some people who, like without any effort, give rise to incredible anger, right? Like the slightest provocation can lead to humongous rage, right? Not just because the person familiarized with that, right? Somebody else, like the slightest cause can lead to like severe anxiety, right? Panic or something like that. Right? It's because the mind is familiar with that. The mind has sort of gotten habituated to that. And the same goes for positive qualities, right? So in other words, why do some people have like incredible love or compassion or wisdom? It's just whatever you familiarize with will come about spontaneously for you. Does that make sense? And so that's part of what he's getting at here is you're going to familiarize yourself with something, right? I mean, that's just the nature of being alive, is that we get into patterns and we sort of interact with the world in certain ways. And so he's saying if you're going to create patterns, just create the patterns of the path, right? Create patterns of ethics, create patterns of compassion, patterns of generosity. And they'll become what's natural for you. And then, like, there's a quote in the Lama Tsongkhapa where he says something like, even, first of all, he says various things. He says, like, one is, even if you think it's impossible, it'll still happen. Then he said, even if you don't want it to happen, enlightenment will still happen because the causes will be there, right? Like, whereas if you create the causes for something, it will come about because that's the nature of reality. And so, on the one hand, if a person says, oh, I wish I were enlightened, but they're not creating the causes, it's not going to happen. On the other hand, if a person's creating all the causes, there are examples like that where the person was thinking, like they were creating all the causes and then they think, oh, I don't care about myself, I don't care if I become enlightened, I just want the benefit of others, but they become enlightened anyway because they created the causes for that. Does that make sense? So that's kind of also what Lama Tsongkhapa is implying here. And so then he gives some final advice for this section. He says, so he basically says this: if you've already taken the bodhisattva vow, then familiarize yourself with the practices as I've just been describing, and naturally you'll fulfill your vow and you'll progress on the path. And then he says, and if you have not yet taken the bodhisattva vow, then he says, then think about the benefits and the wish to practice these things. So you think about what the meaning of them are, think about what the benefits are, and your enthusiasm and interest will increase. And if you don't think about it, of course, it won't increase, because that's also a causative dependently arisen phenomena. And how does enthusiasm for a thing, anything, arise? Is seeing the benefits of it, and becoming interested in it, and sort of seeing, oh, that has meaning or purpose or use, or And so he's saying, so if you want to increase your enthusiasm for bodhisattva conduct, you have to think about what it is and what are the benefits of it. Does that make sense? And there he ends this whole section. So that's the end of that section on the 6 perfections and the 4 means of benefiting, gathering disciples and benefiting disciples. Actually, I'll pause. Any question? Any other questions? But any other questions before I go on to the next part? So then comes, as I was describing, like the last, a little more than a third of the text is mostly this final section called calm abiding and special insight. And so we covered the 6 perfections, and then Lama Tsongkhapa says the training in the last 2 perfections in particular consist in methods of cultivating calm abiding and special insight, because those 2 are included in the perfections of concentration and wisdom, respectively. And so he's getting at there, and he'll go on to explain more, but he's now going to go into greater detail about the last 2 perfections. And also he's making a point that, let's say this right, like, not all concentration is calm abiding, and not all wisdom is special insight. So because for example, there's wisdom, of intellectually understanding the teaching on karma, for example. That's not special insight. But that, so what he's saying is that these 2 points, though, meditative, calm abiding meditation and special insight, are particularly important, and they're included within those last 2 perfections. Does that make sense? So it's like, what's I say, right? Not all of wisdom is special insight, but all special insight is wisdom, right? And he's saying, and special insight is a particularly important kind of wisdom, for example. And not all states of concentration are calm abiding, but calm abiding is a particularly important kind of concentration. And so he's saying, because these are so important, I'm now going to explain them in greater detail, because if you want to progress, if you progress in these 2 points, everything else will come along. Does that make sense? So they're particularly important on a practical level for progressing and for developing. If you develop these 2, then your practice of those last 2 perfections will mature. Yeah.
So mainly we have a concentration, but like the concentration which yields equanimity, so that is calm abiding, or something similar to that.
Actually, calm abiding is, we'll go into it in detail here, but what happens actually is, so as you begin to practice concentration meditation, right? I mean, at first, like, at the very beginning, right, we would say, it's hard to even keep your mind for a moment on the object, right? So if a person chooses an object to concentrate on, at the beginning their mind will jump away, right? Almost all the time. And then slowly, right, the mind becomes able to stay a little longer with the object of concentration, whether it's the breath, or whether it's loving kindness, or whether it's an image of the Buddha. You can choose all different objects, right? But gradually your mind becomes a little easier to stay, right? And now, actually, Lama Tsongkhapa is going to go through all this, but in both the Buddhist and the Hindu traditions, both, they have the same description of, in both traditions of what happens. It's almost like a scientific description about, based on many, thousands of years of people's experience of meditation. So, in the Buddhist, there are different ways to categorize it, but in the Buddhist, in this text, for example, and other Buddhist texts he's basing on previous ones, they describe 9 different experientially distinct and identifiable in one's own experience levels of concentration that one goes through, where one's ability to stay with the object of concentration, first of all, becomes longer. But then not only longer, like that's one point, is that the person can concentrate longer on the object, right? But then Lama Tsongkhapa goes into great detail about this. There are 2 main obstacles to calm abiding. So one is, call it like a distraction, or I would go like, it's basically a state where, because of our habituation to desire, the mind jumps towards something else.
Like what we know as 5 hindrances.
Yeah, so it goes through all that, exactly. So he'll go through all those topics, exactly. And then sinking, right, where your mind's too dull. So part of meditative calm abiding is developing this state of mind where you can keep the mind, first of all, on the object, but without excitation, and also without dullness. So there's a kind of vibrancy and deep concentration, but no distraction. And you progress through these 9 stages, and there comes a point. But so, to answer your, so then the point of calm abiding is where the mind can hold the object for as long as you want. And this practitioner who develops calm abiding actually goes past the 9th level, so the calm abiding comes after that. And that state, because of the depth of their concentration, they give rise to an experience that they describe as physical and mental bliss and pliancy, they call it, like the ability to use the mind and body as one wishes. So in the state, when a person has achieved actual calm abiding, their mind becomes completely absorbed in the meditation object, and they can do that for as long as they want, 24 hours, 48 hours. Like, if they enter into deep meditative concentration, their mind and body won't move until they want it to. So it's like a complete, they have complete self-control in that sense over their concentration.
So in a nutshell, I get it as like a capability of mind to remain with the object as longer as possible, but it begins at the level like where you can at least stay a little longer.
Exactly.
Than momentary kind of thing.
And that's the beginning of the practice of. So we have to differentiate. Like, the practice of cultivating calm abiding begins at that point. The actual calm abiding doesn't happen until the person achieves
9.
After the 9th level. Yeah. So you could say we're cultivating calm abiding when we achieve the 1st level, but we don't actually have calm abiding until after the 9th level, when we achieve the actual bliss and pliancy and so on. Yeah. So that's it. Yeah. So you could say, like, so a person could say, I'm going to go do a retreat on calm abiding, and the first day they're doing a retreat practicing calm abiding, but they don't yet have calm abiding, of course. But if they reach that level where they achieve that resultant state, then that's calm abiding.
It's like going to kindergarten, but graduation will happen whenever it happens.
Exactly. Yeah. But you started the process of moving towards graduation. Yeah. Exactly. So now Lama Tsongkhapa begins just explaining a little bit about these topics, right? Because he's sort of going to introduce us to the topics. So he begins as he begins almost every section of the book, right, with what are the benefits of these things, right? Because you've noticed probably that pattern, right? Because that he's like, why would I want to cultivate that? So he's described a little bit about the benefits. But first, he actually, as he sometimes does, he gets into a little bit of a philosophical point. So he quotes a sutra called the Sutra Unraveling the Intended Meaning. So it says, in that sutra, it is set forth that all mundane and supramundane positive qualities of the Mahayana and Hinayana are the results of calm abiding and special insight. So the sutra says, so mundane, right, supramundane means states of enlightenment, right, like Buddhahood or arhatship, because it includes the Hinayana here. So he says that can include like a state of a solitary realizer, or arhat, somebody who achieved only their own liberation, not a Buddha. So it's saying those what do you call it, supramundane states, and also mundane states, right? Like so having states like calm, like just having a peaceful mind, having bodhicitta, having some of mundane achievements would also include things like the various clairvoyances and so on. So it says all of those are the results of calm abiding and special insight. And then Lama Tsongkhapa says, so you may wonder. So he's raising a doubt. Right? He's saying, but aren't calm abiding and special insight positive qualities of the mind that are gained from meditation? So he's basically saying, okay, this quote said all positive qualities are the result of calm abiding and special insight. But he says that doesn't make sense, because somebody who's just beginning meditation and doesn't yet have calm abiding or special insight, as you were just raising, right? The person hasn't yet succeeded in developing, say, calm abiding. But calm abiding comes about as a result of their practice. So they're practicing, but they don't yet have calm abiding, but something good comes about because of it, which is calm abiding, right? So how can you say all good things come from calm abiding when calm abiding itself comes from something? Does that make sense? If you didn't do a meditation to practice calm abiding, you would never get calm abiding. So he's raising like a philosophical objection in a way, right? And then he says, there are a couple points that were made in the commentary. One is, if you were to say literally, right, every positive quality comes about as a result of combining and special insight, that would not be correct, actually, because there are positive qualities that come about before the person has gained either of those states. But then, so he makes a couple points. One is that for sure, one thing that's actually true is that the advanced states of the path actually do depend on those. So, in other words, to achieve actual sort of the advanced levels of the path, you do actually have to have common binding and special insight. That's one point. But then he says, in a more kind of general way, if you say what leads up to common binding, if we include, as you were just describing, right, if you were to say, well, all the practices that are leading us towards being able to abide on the object with concentration eventually lead to common binding. So we'll include those in the side of common binding. And then he says, and if you were to include all analytical meditations, all analysis, all sort of deep sort of reflection under special insight, as leading to special insight, then you can sort of categorize analytical meditation is in the category of special insight, and anytime you're cultivating some concentration, that's in the category of common binding. And he says, then actually all good qualities do come about through those. And he says, but that's not a literal, that's a sort of broad way of using language. So he's sort of saying you can't take that quote exactly literally, but if you use the language in a sort of broader way, you can say, in general, all things do come about through either practicing some sort of meditation or some sort of analysis. So he's making a kind of philosophical reflection on this quote. So he says, therefore, there's really ultimately no contradiction. Then he says, okay, then he again quotes a sutra, that same sutra, the Sutra Unraveling the Intended Meaning, and he says, the quote says, having familiarized themselves with calm abiding and special insight, beings will gain complete liberation from bondage of bad states and signs. And he goes on to explain this, I'll just explain briefly. What it's saying there is, actually what it's really getting at is this, is when you cultivate, if you cultivate calm abiding, right, meditative concentration and calm abiding, that has an effect on a person who cultivates it of, you can say, like, temporarily suppressing your bad habits. So, like, in other words, that if you gain, the more you, actually, this is, we can see this in like a very simplistic way. You know, all the scientific research, which is not on calm abiding actually, but is on just mindfulness, right? That just by cultivating simple mindfulness, like, bad habits of mind and body decrease. That's been well shown in actually scientific research, right? Like, so, you know, it's people who had tended to be angry or anxious or depressed, that those qualities decrease if they practice mindfulness regularly. So as you begin to develop some degree of, just a little bit even, of meditative concentration, it starts to suppress your negative habits of body and mind. And what he's getting at here is, if you actually cultivate, the more you cultivate meditation, the more that happens. So there's like a temporary suppression of bad habits through meditation. Obviously, when you're meditating, you're not doing, you know, if you're sitting like this and concentrating, you're not doing anything bad with your body because you're not moving around. But what he's getting at here really is, if you really cultivate these qualities of meditative concentration, it has an effect on the body and mind, actually, which again have been shown to some degree in scientific research, but in the Buddhist tradition has done more extensive, has a more extensive literature on that. But that it sort of, it suppresses all kinds of bad habits of body and mind. So, like, you know, uncontrolled habits of sort of acting out and sort of saying things and impulsively and so on. If you're cultivating meditation regularly, they just don't do that as much. It sort of decreases those habits. And if you develop actual calm abiding, it very profoundly sort of suppresses those negative habits of body and mind. And so when it says bad states, it's referring to that. Bad states of body and mind are suppressed by calm abiding. And then signs means like, it's sometimes a technical term in Buddhist literature. So it means grasping at signs means like grasping at signs of independent existence, or of things existing independently or inherently or intrinsically. So it's signs of independent existence, I'll say. And it's special insight that overcomes that. It's only through special insight into emptiness, particularly into the ultimate view of how things exist, is the only thing that can overcome the habit of grasping at things as existing independently or existing from their own side, sort of different ways to say it. And so the idea here really is this, is that, first of all, if you're, from a practice point of view, the more you cultivate calm abiding, the more you can successfully sort of on a temporary basis or in a temporary way suppress your negative habits and so on. But it's only through special insight that you gain a permanent freedom by uprooting the cause, the actual underlying cause of all those negativities, which is ignorance, because ignorance is the root affliction of all the other afflictions. And so it's only by and another point is it's only by combining those two that any being ever becomes liberated from samsara. So the only way to become liberated from actual samsaric existence, doing so depends upon achieving a union, actually, of so where you've cultivated calm abiding, and then you unify that with special insight into the nature of reality. And so part of what Lama Tsongkhapa is getting at here is, right, because one of the title of this benefit was part of the section is explaining this, basically, that the only way to achieve liberation from samsara is to achieve these two qualities. And even if you practice all the other aspects of the path, if you don't gain calm abiding and special insight and unify them, you won't become liberated from samsara. And there are many different ways to achieve those two in union, in sutra and in tantra and so on. But if you don't use one of those and actually achieve that, you won't achieve liberation. Yeah, so that's that. Then he says, yeah. So I mean that's the ultimate. That's the sense of what he's getting at there. And also, I guess I'll make one more point, that we have to do both, right? We have to overcome we have to temporarily overcome our negative habits. We also have to uproot the underlying cause. Does that make sense? And the one, just suppressing them temporarily is not sufficient. They'll come back if you don't gain insight into the nature of reality. Because wisdom is the only antidote to ignorance, and as long as ignorance is there, all the other mental afflictions will eventually come back. So we need special insight. And then he makes another point. He says, and this is quite true actually, obviously, is in the Hinayana and the Mahayana traditions and texts and practices, there are many, many, many different states of meditative concentration that are described, like where they'll say this bodhisattva or this arhat was in this meditative concentration, in this meditative state, and so on. And he says, those who strive for meditative stabilization cannot investigate all its limitless manifestations. So in other words, if you try to understand meditation by looking into what are each of those, and there are countless different meditative concentrations, it'll become daunting to you. And he says, but if you just simply cultivate calm abiding, all those other states will come about naturally, and you'll understand them experientially. Calm abiding is sort of the gateway to all those meditative concentrations. So if you cultivate calm abiding, then you won't have to have sort of, if you start now by studying all those different states and the descriptions of them, you won't be able to achieve them, and they'll seem quite distant and hard to understand. But if you cultivate calm abiding through these 9 stages, then all those other states will result from that naturally, because they come from calm abiding and they arise from the experience. Calm abiding is sort of the they come about naturally for some, and they're quite achievable for somebody who's already realized calm abiding. If you haven't realized calm abiding, they're not achievable anyway.
So basically, the wisdom to achieve those states is a result of calm abiding, and then vice versa.
Yeah, exactly. They're a result. Yeah, so you have to cultivate. So on a practical level, for those of us who have not yet achieved calm abiding, yeah, exactly. The point would be cultivate calm abiding, and then if you read about those states, you can actually achieve them at that point. And especially if you unify calm abiding and special insight, then you can achieve all the different states of the path. And so then Lama Tsongkhapa says, the next section he calls it, the outline rather, says, the entities of calm abiding and special insight. And again, he quotes the sutra unraveling the intended meaning. So he's been relying on this particular sutra quite a bit in this section. And it starts off, he says, the entity of calm abiding is set forth in the sutra unraveling the intended meaning. And then he quotes, dwelling alone in solitude, one directs the mind inward and attends to those very phenomena. So there, I'll keep going in a sec, but there he's saying, he's beginning to describe what is calm abiding, right? So he says to develop calm abiding, the person dwells in solitude, right? So they go to a quiet place to meditate, right? Alone. And then he says, but it's not enough to have your body in solitude, your mind has to turn inward, right? So it means that you turn your mind away from distraction to external objects, and you turn it inward to those very phenomena, just as he has thoroughly reflected upon them, right? So in other words, that you're choosing so this inner phenomena means an object of concentration, right? So first you have to take your body away from external distractions, but then you have to bring your mind away from external distractions to cultivate calm abiding, right? So you have to bring your mind inward to a particular object, and he'll go into this in detail, but you choose an object, you choose something to meditate on, in other words, and then you have to bring your mind inward into that, to focus on that object. And then it says, the meditator attends to the objects of concentration with a mind directed inward continuously and attentively. The states he thus enters and abides in many times, in which physical and mental pliancy arise, is called calm abiding. So it's saying here, right, I mean, it's a very brief description, it's going to be much more elaborate, but he's saying, right, so first you put the body away from distraction, then you bring the mind inward, you begin concentrating on some particular object. In the instruction you'll see, the idea for cultivating calm abiding is you choose a particular object of concentration and you stay with it. You stay with the same object to develop this more and more. And then he says, and again, it's familiarization, right? It says, he thus enters and abides many times, right? So in other words, you have to keep doing this. You start with very short sessions and you keep going back to the object and concentrating on it. And it says continuously and attentively, right? So attentively means with clarity. It's not just sort of a dull state of mind, but with a kind of very clear, attentive, aware, an aware state, but without distraction, right? And then he makes this point. Eventually, as I was mentioning, you gain what are called physical and mental pliancy. Actually, bliss and pliancy, really. This text mentions pliancy. And when you achieve those, you achieve calm abiding. So he's getting at you were asking a question, what's the definition of calm abiding? And in part, this text is saying that it's when the person has succeeded in having achieved physical and mental bliss and pliancy. And pliancy means, the bliss is an experience, right, of bliss. The pliancy means on a physical level, that at that point the body, like ordinarily we feel, like you can, if you make effort, you get to a feeling of like sometimes you feel heavy, your body feels heavy or feels tired or feels, they say that for the person who's achieved pliancy, their body doesn't have that experience. Their body feels very light. It's like light and sort of flexible and sort of serviceable, usable. They don't develop fatigue. And then the same with the mind. There comes a point where your mind, like for us, if you use your mind to concentrate on something like work or whatever, or some task, then there comes a point where your mind develops fatigue, right? You can't focus anymore. Your mind develops a kind of feeling of like it's tired or can't do it anymore. You can't continue to focus well. For somebody who's achieved calm abiding, that doesn't happen. They don't have that experience.
But could it be that is not the take the advantage of this mind and body, but that state is a little bit, because like I heard that like in those particular stage, even your breathing also, breath also like slows down quite a bit.
Yeah, for the person actually to
And,
achieve calm abiding, they actually say that you can't. What's it say right? That's true. That if you looked at, I mean, the person looks alive. They're they're sitting up in meditation, but you can't find the breath. Like if you were outside them and you put like you can't measure their breath. So they're so it's in such a deep state of peace.
yeah, so basically, is that like maybe they are not using their physical mind, physical body is like, and then so it's like, so there's something else is.
Yeah, the idea. Well, a couple points to that. I mean, one is what's it say right? Like at that level of concentration, and where the person has achieved that. Actually, the reason though, first of all, the reason though, they say that from a Tibetan Buddhist perspective, they say the reason that that the breath becomes like that is that the way there's a whole system that Tibetans describe, Tibetan Buddhists, actually Indian Buddhists also describe, where the mind and the subtle energies of the body are connected. They call them the wind energies, but like something's like prana or similar to the concept of chi in East Asia. The subtle energy of the body is connected to the movement of the mind in that sense. So what they say is that when the mind becomes that deeply peaceful and concentrated, the subtle energies of the body, because the mind's not moving, the subtle energy of the body stop moving. And so it's kind of a very, so it actually, the mind and body, there was, what's it say right? So all those subtle energies in this sort of subtle body, according to the Buddhist tradition, they all become sort of peaceful, and they sort of stop moving, and they become almost like a wind that's died down, or a lake there's no wind, where it's just sort of like a mirror. The subtle energy of the body become like that, and so the body becomes extremely pacified in a way. And then after that, they say that it changes, actually, the subtle body. Having achieved this realization of calm abiding actually changes how your subtle body's energy moves, it works. And so the person, as long as they continue practicing, it actually changes them on a physical level in terms of how even when they arise from meditation, their body is different in a way from somebody who has not achieved calm abiding. I remember, I was thinking of this story, I was thinking of this experience. One time, I had this project where I was supposed to, it never worked out, actually, I wasn't able to do it, but I started working with Lama Tsongkhapa on a book about, it was supposed to be about like self-esteem. The book didn't work really, but I was asking him questions, so like about different, and I said to him, I said, in the West, oftentimes people, it's like stress, and people are tired, and they're stressed out from their job, and I said, like, how does Rinpoche deal with like stress and fatigue, like, and being fatigued and tired? And he said, I'm sorry, but I've never had that experience, so I can't honestly answer your question because I've never felt that. And Rinpoche was like, it is, I guess, like, I don't know if he was like late 50s at the time or something. And I said, well, but Rinpoche sometimes doesn't sleep, and like he's traveling all over the world, and like I didn't, it was like Rinpoche's traveled the world and teaches like all night sometimes. Hasn't Rinpoche ever? I said, like, haven't you ever felt tired? And Rinpoche said, he said, I'm really sorry. I apologize, but I can't answer the questions. I haven't had that experience. Ask me again when I'm older. Maybe I'll have had it then, and I can answer for you. I was like, oh wow. I was like, Rinpoche's way of being in the world is so different from other people's. But that answer is truthful. If for somebody who's gained calm abiding, they don't have that. There's the experience of, there's a kind of mental and physical experience that ordinary people have that they don't have because their mind and body actually are different, and that's a result of calm abiding. So they can engage in, both in meditation but also in the post-meditative state. The way their body and mind interact with the world is different than the way someone who doesn't have calm abiding interacts with the world, and they actually don't experience those things. Like they're not, and because it's not how their subtle energies don't work in the same way as other people's subtle energies. Which is just interesting. So here he goes into, he clarifies the meaning of that statement. So he says, the meaning of that is that if the mind, having attended to it continuously without distraction, stays on the object by itself, so that the joyful bliss of physical and mental pliancy arise, that meditative stabilization becomes calm abiding. This will arise from merely keeping the mind inward, undistracted. It does not depend upon internalizing the suchness of things. So what he's saying there is, first of all, you don't have to have previously realized emptiness in order to develop calm abiding. When he says it doesn't depend upon realizing suchness, you can gain calm abiding before you've understood emptiness or suchness, is one point he's making. The other is he's just clear, as I already said, he's defining, so what is calm abiding? It's when you can continuously and without distraction for as long as you want, stay with an object of meditation, and just that process itself of staying with the object of meditation naturally gives rise to this experience of joyful bliss, of physical and mental pliancy. So he's saying when you've achieved that, you've achieved, he's just describing what is calm abiding. He's saying that's what it is. And so that person who's achieved calm abiding, right, I mean, there was a whole process to get to that point, but once they're at that point, what he's saying also is like, for that person, any object, so if they sit down to meditate on any topic, like whether it be love, or a picture of a Buddha, or compassion, or wisdom, just by sort of, first of all, just without effort, just by bringing an object to mind, their mind absorbs with that object in an undistracted way, and naturally there's experience of, as he could, joyful bliss of physical and mental pliancy. It arises naturally for them because they've developed this kind of concentration. And so it's, and at that level of concentration, actually levels before that still take some subtle effort. At the level of calm abiding, all it takes is an intention. Like the person has to develop, they develop an intention. I want to meditate on this, and then naturally their mind absorbs in that meditation. They no longer have to sort of strive to concentrate at that point. Then he says, so okay, that's the definition or the entity of calm abiding. What's the entity or definition of special insight? So now he says, and he quotes the same sutra, right, the Sutra Unraveling the Intended Meaning. And he says, having achieved physical pliancy and mental pliancy, the meditator then abides in them and abandons aspects of the mind and devotes himself to the individual investigation of images within, the objects of meditative stabilization, the very phenomena he has likewise reflected upon. Thus, with regard to the images that are objects of meditative stabilization, any thorough differentiation of the meaning of those objects of knowledge, any exceedingly thorough differentiation, full investigation, full analysis, tolerance, acceptance, classification, viewing, and conceptualization is called special insight. In that way, the Bodhisattva is skilled in special insight. And then Lama Tsongkhapa explains a little bit. He says, here, thorough differentiation is a differentiation of the varieties, and exceedingly thorough differentiation is a differentiation of the mode. Investigation is coarse investigation, and analysis is subtle analysis. So I just want to explain a little bit. So what's being gotten at here is first of all, special insight's a very broad, or is a very profound, rather, topic. But part of what he's getting at here is that, let's say it the right way, the most important, the most important, and from a spiritual perspective, and from a practitioner's perspective, the most important kind of special insight is special insight into the ultimate nature of reality, emptiness. But that's not the only kind of special insight. And I want to explain a little bit what this is getting at, what that means, is what he's getting at here, right? He's saying, for the person who's achieved calm abiding, if they engage then in, which was, earlier he defined wisdom, right, as a clear insight based on analysis, right? That was the definition of what is wisdom in general. So here, having cultivated calm abiding, the person uses analysis to come to some kind of an insight about a topic. Does that make sense? And whatever that topic, there are many different examples of topics where one can then cultivate special insight. The most important one is the ultimate nature of things, right, or the self or objects, and their emptiness. But I just want to give an example. in Buddhist, for somebody who's cultivated calm abiding, remember I said, Lama Tsongkhapa said, there are countless divisions of meditative concentration, that he said that. So some examples of that are, after the person has achieved calm abiding, there are what are called the four concentrations, and the four that are associated with the form realm, and there are four concentrations associated with the formless realms. And those, so in order to achieve the first of those, I'll just describe, there's a kind of special insight you have to have, so that's why I'm mentioning it. And in that special insight, after you can only do this once you've achieved calm abiding, right? But the person who achieved calm abiding has one example of a special insight, is they then look at what in Buddhist terminology is called the desire realm. It's the realm we're all in. It's the realm of an embodied being like us, who are mostly controlled by desire all the time. Right? There's like almost all, not all the time, but almost all the time, we want something. Right? And so the person who's achieved calm abiding, they can have this experience where they look around at the desire realm, right? At ordinary ways that people exist and interact, right? And they can have this insight, recognizing, wow, living in a way where one is controlled by continuous craving and desire is a kind of suffering. And having achieved calm abiding, the person recognizes, oh, I can go beyond that suffering through meditative concentration. I can enter into a state where I move past such craving, and where I can temporarily escape from that state. And that gives me a greater level of happiness and peace than any kind of state of having what I want can give me. And through that insight, they actually sort of, what's the word? Their concentration moves them past all desire, right? All craving of the desire realm. And they enter into what's called the form realm, which is a realm, a subtler realm than this realm. And that doesn't mean, they still have a body, but experientially, they're in a state, a meditative state of concentration, where they no longer are perceiving external. First of all, they're no longer perceiving the external world. Their mind is so absorbed in the concentrated state that they no longer see, hear, and so on. They're just in a mental kind of, in a state of concentration. But that experience comes about due to the insight that the desire realm, that engaging with the desire realm is a kind of suffering, and therefore they move past the desire realm into the form realm, into the first the first level of meditative concentration. So that's a kind of special insight that's not I'm just giving an example. That's a special insight that's not a special insight into emptiness, it's a special insight into the nature of the desire realm. And it's a correct insight, and it gives rise to an experience, so that would be an example of special insight that's not special insight into emptiness. But the most important version of special insight is into emptiness. And so here the person can do, there are many different, so the point being, you remember, like again, he said there are many concentrations and many experiences. So having gained calm abiding, that I'm just giving a couple of examples, a few examples, but this person at that point, by, as he describes, by differentiating and analyzing and, just by using that that deeply concentrated mind to analyze things, they can give rise to various kinds of experience in their own meditation that are different kinds of concentrations. And those all come about. Actually, the second concentration, like I mentioned, there are 4 levels of meditative concentration, and then the 4 formless. So those 4, the second one comes about because the person realizes, oh wow, like this state is more blissful than the desire realm was, but there's another state that's even more blissful and more peaceful and more pacified than this. And they can sort of understand the faults of the state they're in as compared to the next level of, they can now see what it would be like to get to the next level of concentration. And they then say, oh, I'd rather abandon this and have that experience. And through that insight, they then shift to the next level.
The way you place it like more peacefully, there's more stress involved, like at the moment, as you mentioned in our physical world, sensual desire, we have more stress involved. And this is like less stressful, and this gets less and lesser stressful states.
Exactly.
To abide in.
Yep. Yeah, I remember one time I was talking with a monk who was known to have a Western monk actually, who was known to have achieved a very high level of meditative concentration like this. And I remember saying to, I was like asking him some questions. I was just curious about what, I was sort of curious to ask him about his experience. And that was part of what he was saying. I was saying, oh wow, a lot of, like, I said to him, a lot of Western monks, you see, like, where they become a monk and then they get tired of it, they don't stay a monk, they go back and they, get a job and get married or something. I said, you've been a monk a long time, you didn't. And he said, he made this point, he said, if you don't, he was saying, like, he was being sympathetic to those other monks, but he was just sort of saying, if you don't achieve these levels of meditative concentration, then external things still seem desirable, like, because there's a kind of pleasure, right, in having enough, having certain comforts or having a partner or having whatever. And then he was saying, but if you achieve a certain level of meditative concentration, then that pleasure doesn't seem interesting anymore, naturally, because the pleasure of the meditative state is so much greater than than the pleasure of having a nice hotel room or a nice meal or a partner or friendships, or not that you care about people, but in terms of like needing something for yourself, the pleasure of the meditation is viscerally and experientially so much greater that it's no longer tempting.
One of the main reasons, like, I see is that there's so much stress involved to maintain all those things compared to, hey, you sit and you're in that state, and
it's automatic.
It's kind of more of a dependent on you rather than more external things, so less things to manage.
Yep.
But another which I don't know whether Lama Tsongkhapa mentions that or not, but like when I mentioned 5 hindrances, like, it's not just if you have antidote for sensual desire and you can get into that state, but no, you have to, I heard that you have to overcome all the 5 hindrances, like sloth and torpor, restless and worry.
Yeah. And he gets into the antidotes to each of them here.
So all of them, all the five of them has to be head down to at least get to that.
Exactly. Yeah, and he goes through antidotes to each of them in order in his text. And now he just quotes some other, how do you say it? How statements from other sutras and commentaries accord with the sutra unraveling the intended meaning. So he quotes he just quotes some other sources. So the Cloud of Jewels Sutra says, calm abiding is a one-pointed mind, and special insight is investigation. Then he quotes Maitreya, restraint to the concepts of dharmas should also be known as the path of calm abiding. Full analysis of their meanings as the path of special insight. So you're getting the sense of this, though, right? Calm abiding is the state of concentration that's one-pointed, right? And that special insight comes about through investigation or analysis, right? So that to gain special insight, the practitioner, and actually, again, like on a mundane level, right? Lama Tsongkhapa early, I just want to point this out again, just to be really clear, right? On a mundane level, like, so somebody who doesn't yet have calm abiding, wisdom, right, comes about through analysis, right? So for us, for ordinary people, right, how do we gain greater wisdom? It's through asking questions, through thinking deeply, through analyzing based on reasoning and experience, and coming to a clear conclusion about a topic, right? That we gain some kind of new wisdom. And sometimes that comes about, through reading, through asking questions, through discussion with friends, and ultimately through our own analysis, though, where we can come to a kind of clear insight based on our own investigation of a topic. And each time we do that, if we get to some kind of clear understanding, that's increasing our wisdom. Special insight is similar then, right? And so again, it uses these words, analysis or investigation, right? So it doesn't come about, like everything else, it comes about due to causes and conditions, right? Nothing comes about causelessly. Everything is dependent, right? So insight, in this sense, and special insight, in this, as he's saying, depend upon analysis, depend upon investigation, depend on some kind of careful consideration and then gaining an insight, right? So the word, even the word special insight, right? Or special seeing, like it's a unique kind of seeing that comes about by the mind being able to see something because it's analyzed it and come to a definitive, clear conclusion about that topic. And he quotes again Maitreya, depending on correct abiding, what serves to place the mind on the mind and to differentiate dharmas are calm abiding and special insight. And then he quotes actually the second stages of meditation, which is by Kamala Shila. And I'll read the quote again. Abidance within the mind itself, in which distraction towards external objects has calmed down, and the mind gets continuously and naturally involved in its internal object with joy and pliancy, is called calm abiding. That which thoroughly analyzes at the time of abiding, in that very state of calm abiding, is special insight. And I'll make another point here. I'll just, to kind of further elaborate on this, in his commentary, there's a commentary on Mahamudra by the first Panchen Lama, Losing Choki Gyaltsen, where he's teaching on Mahamudra, and he makes this point, he says, so actually, because it's related to this, where he says the mind on the mind. Like, so there are many different objects of concentration, first of all. To develop calm abiding, as I was mentioning, a person can meditate actually on almost any object, right? They can take up an object to mind and then develop the concentration on that object. One point I'll make, though, is that at a certain point, the object has to be mental. And we'll get into this more later, but, so like there is, actually, because you were pointing out, right, the breath becomes so, if you try to meditate on the breath to get calm abiding, there will come a point where the breath is so subtle that it no longer is perceivable, so therefore you'll at that point you can't continue to use it to develop your calm abiding. So to develop calm abiding, you have to use a mental object. So it could be, again, like sometimes a person can visualize the Buddha or can visualize a deity like Tara, or a person can meditate on love, or or emptiness, or there are many different topics. One of the topics that sometimes is meditated upon is the nature of mind itself. So in other words, you can meditate on the clear knowing, or clear empty, clear clarity and emptiness, the clear and knowing state of mind, I'll call it. And then the mind itself becomes the object of concentration. And that's just another object of concentration. So I was going to say, so the Panchen Lama gives, in this commentary, Mahamudra meditation, ultimately is meditation on emptiness, but part of the practice is you can develop calm abiding on where the object is the conventional nature of the mind, its clarity and awareness. And then he gives this, that's related to, he makes a point related to this. He says, after the person has gained calm abiding, so their mind is completely, they can completely concentrate their mind on the nature of mind itself. But he says, they've not yet gained special insight at that point, this person, right? So then he says, he gives this analogy, he says, that practitioner, he uses this metaphor, he says, it's like a clear lake, right, with no wind. So like, imagine a lake that's like totally crystal. Have you ever been, like, I remember once when I was young, I was in the Rocky Mountains, and like in the morning, there was this lake, and like, it was completely like a mirror, where you could see the sky reflected in the lake with complete clarity, right? And there was no movement, not even the slightest movement on that lake. It was like a perfect mirror of the sky, right? So your mind, he's using that metaphor. In Tibet, that would be a typical, I imagine they see that often. So he's saying the experience for that person is that their mind is completely clear and peaceful like that. Then he uses this metaphor, he says, and then like a tiny fish under the surface that doesn't cause any ripple. A tiny part of your mind analyzes the nature of reality, and it analyzes the emptiness of the mind itself in that sense. So he uses this quite interesting metaphor like that. So it's like the meditative calm abiding is like the peaceful lake, totally undisturbed, totally clear, totally crystalline, and totally unmoving. But then there's a very slight, and then with intention, the practitioner has this very subtle movement, a very subtle part of their mind that can then analyze the nature of mind itself, like a tiny fish, he says, under the surface, that doesn't disturb at all the surface of the water, but that can still move. So he says, within that piece, there's this kind of very subtle, small part of the mind that analyzes at that time, and that analysis is what gives rise to special insight. And because it hasn't moved, the mind hasn't moved, the piece of the mind hasn't been disturbed, there's this experience then of a union, where the two are not separate. You know, earlier, like one can do contemplative meditation to think, and then one sort of concentrates. But they're two separate states. But at this point, one can join them. That's the difference, right? Like, so, actually, even like if we're a beginner, right, we can sort of think about something and analyze it, and then we can go meditate on it, right? But they're two separate, you have to do them at separate times. But at this point, the practitioner is able to do them at the same time. Whereas their mind is so subtle that they can stay in that state of calm and peaceful, clear abiding, and they can also analyze. And for us, what we have to do to get towards that, of course, is we start off by doing them separately, right? So as beginners, you know, we might sit down and sort of study a text and then meditate on it, contemplate it, right? What does that mean? And how does that relate to my experience? And when, you know, analyzes one's own experience and so on. And that's contemplation. And let's say, for example, if you're meditating on the mind cherishing others, right? So you might analyze there are many teachings, we studied them in this text on that, like, you know, how others are precious and how others deserve to be cherished and loved and so on, and the reasons why one would love others and so on. And you give rise to an experience of love, right, through this analysis, and then you stop analyzing, you concentrate on that experience of love, right? You have the mind stay with the experience of love, right? So they're sequential. But at this point that Lama Tsongkhapa is getting at, one's mind has become so subtle and so adept at meditation that the person can keep the mind in that tranquility and still analyze, without disturbing their tranquility. So it's a quite advanced level of practice, of course. But that's how one eventually conjoins those two. And then they say there comes a point where the analysis itself deepens one's concentration. So there is that the person, like even as they're analyzing, their concentration deepens, and they become completely inseparable, their experience of calm body and special insight. So he's just sort of here what he said, the mind abides within itself, we were just that same quote, right? In which distraction towards external objects is calmed down, right? So he's describing that state, like the crystalline lake.
No, I've asked you this before, but I'm going back to it again, and I know the answer, but I heard another teacher, Western teacher, say something different, so.
What was it?
And that's why I'm asking it again. Like, the causes, at some point, there is no cause and condition, but I know that you say that is not so, that there's always dependent origination. That is, even in this situation, which you just described with the complete union, there's still dependent origination, correct?
Yep.
And that's your, I didn't ask the question, this was years ago, and I brought this up with another before I came here. And I've clearly heard him say, no, there is a point when that is not so. A Western teacher, this is not controversial.
Not controversial, right.
Then I would, okay.
Yeah.
I would have, no, I never asked her.
Ask her that
What,
question.
yeah.
So the person was saying that at that point, there's no
There
longer
is a point.
dependent origination in what sense? Like, or just in general, or
Like, say, for example, the example you just gave, where there's a complete union.
Actually, that has been also been fabricated, that is also, like you made an effort to get to that one pointed concentration, and then you, as mentioned, then you have also again, you have knowledge of bringing a object and doing analysis, investigation.
That's the
And
road there. I
so-
understand the road, but
So
now
it's
we're
like,
at the destination of the union.
yeah, so it's like still it's made up. So but I think only the dependent origination ends, like you break that thing once you are above that Buddhahood, you even like until they are the physical body, still they're cause and they are having they're subject to dependent origination. But once they are, but they are in a capacity of have a mind in such a state afterwards, after this embodiment that it doesn't anymore shape, it's like doesn't have no more causes. So it's a very interesting, like while we are in all these 9 stages, like as you mentioned, like Hindu yogis had practiced it, but only the difference between the Hindu yogi and the Buddha was that I think they thought this is a state, like as you mentioned, it's a permanent state, but and they abided in that for like after their passing of them like eons and eons, but they eventually that cause passed away and they had like again had to rebirth. While in the case of Buddha, like because of his understanding of dependent origination, because of this completely clearing this, seeing the emptiness or getting rid of that ignorance, he was able to transcend that.
I just want to go back and ask you a question related to what you were saying. I just want to make sure I understand something. Because the person who was saying that, it was making me think about something, so I'll ask a question. Like, was your understanding that they were saying that, because there are 2 different, I guess, things I was wondering about, like, or 2 possibilities of the meaning. So I'll ask you if you know, or just what your own sense is. Because one would be to assert, a person could assert, right, that experience is not, somehow the experience a person has is no longer dependently arisen.
Okay.
Or another is a person could assert that emptiness is not
Yes,
dependently arisen.
right.
So were they asserting that the experience or the emptiness?
Well,
Or you think,
you
or what
said
was it?
both. You said you would agree that both.
Both are what?
Or did I miss, no, I could not have, because I know what you think, everything, is dependently arises, even emptiness.
Well, yeah, that's true, but because one
That's
reason
what
I
you
was,
said, so I believe that, I think he misspoke or didn't understand that's what I think. I don't think
it's
he meant-
possible.
Yeah,
But the reason why I was asking is that there are some, just to, maybe this may help, I'm not sure, but like, let's see if I say this right. Okay. So like, in terms of emptiness, like, in terms of experience, I guess I would do, like, in terms of experience, one has to say it's dependently, that's sort of easier, right? To say,
yeah.
if somebody's having an experience,
Oh,
then
yeah.
by almost definition it's dependently, or you could say, well, because there's a person and they're having an experience and they're not, if they were having an experience that they, at a certain time, then obviously that arose at that time for, because they were there and they had, as you were saying, right, they had done some previous things that led to that experience and so on. In terms of emptiness, though, always just one philosophical point, which is that, like, so, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, has talked about this, and other philosophers have, like, so, in general, Tibetans hold Chandrakirti's position on emptiness to be the most profound and most subtle, and Chandrakirti was a follower of Nagarjuna, and their assertion, right, the assertion of comes from the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, which says that one of the kinds of emptiness is that emptiness is empty. Right? They say even emptiness is empty of inherent existence. And they give an example. So they say emptiness is not, according to the middle way school, in that sense, right? Their assertion is emptiness is not, emptiness isn't something that's like sort of out there to go find. It's the nature of a cup. It's the nature of a person. It's the nature of a chair. It's the nature of a room, and so on. And so, the room is empty of inherent existence, right? And so that emptiness is like the ultimate nature of that thing. And so if you were to say, so then you could say, so in a sense, to say the cup is empty of inherent existence depends upon the cup, right? So in that sense, the emptiness of the cup depends upon the cup, because you can't say, like, there's not like an emptiness that's separate from things. but then there are some Tibetan scholars, this is a point of debate, but there are some Tibetan scholars who did assert that, let's see if I say this right, that there's an emptiness that's not empty in a way, and or that emptiness is sort of intrinsically or inherently existent, and that emptiness sort of exists from its own side, and that in that sense that they would sort of assert that emptiness is not empty, or that emptiness is not a dependent origination.
Different schools, actually, or, yeah, like Nyingma might see it that way, and.
Even within the Nyingma, though, not all Nyingma
I
schools.
thought, this may be in a
So that could-
generalization, okay.
Not all Nyingma
But not-
scholars agree with it. Not even, I mean, there are
So
Nyingma
it's
scholars who would disagree with that,
within
but
the
some.
different groups, okay, that there would be in this discussion, even.
Yeah,
Not
so-
that they're unilaterally gonna.
No,
Okay.
there's no
I
school,
thought
there's
I
no,
read that, yeah, but anyway, that's fine, yeah.
so it could be that. That's why I was just
Yeah,
like,
it could be that, and that's what I think maybe, yeah. I'm gonna ask him, actually,
yeah, because if that's
out
what,
of curiosity, I'm gonna ask him.
you can, because
Well,
if
I
that's
don't
what he's
know
asserting,
why, except I'm
then that's
trying to
okay.
understand emptiness.
Yeah.
And if I am, like, this helps me, I know this may be seeming kind of esoteric to people, or too far out, but for me, this is helpful to I don't know why, but I know it's helping me.
It's good to think about
Think
those
about
things.
this particular.
I think it's a good
For
topic.
some reason.
And so, yeah, if you ask him, but that's what I would ask, because if there was, because I guess my point would be this: if a person were just saying, like, like a person had an experience and that experience was not dependently arisen, well, that would be kind of a silly assertion in a way. But if a person were saying that they think that, in some sense, that there's a sense in which emptiness is
I
not
think that's
dependently
what we're
origination,
talking about in this conversation.
okay.
It wasn't for the group.
then at least the person then might be relying upon a certain philosopher, like,
Yeah.
a certain specific, like there are various Tibetan philosophers who asserted that, and actually in this text and some other texts, Lama Tsongkhapa raises those issues, actually. You'll see in the section on emptiness, he says some philosophers assert a view like that, and then he disagrees with it and explains why he disagrees with it and debates with it. But the fact that he raises it and sort of debates with it is showing, well, okay, that's, that's an assertion of some philosophers. That's not a sort of, what's it say, right? It's how some philosophers have understood the teachings on
All the
emptiness
things are
and so on.
basically that doesn't, like, because we can arrive to conclusion, but may not be refined conclusion because things may be different.
Yeah.
They are not the thing as they are, and it's a tool. Sometimes I feel like this emptiness is a tool that negating all those things, like cup is not a cup, or this camera is not a camera, me is not me, in a way, and then going into subtler and subtler, and because what exactly it is, actual true in true nature it is not all these things which you can think of or analyze, but doing that you reach to that what it is, and which is undescribable. It's beyond our even beyond our, because if it had any relativity anywhere, then it's beyond that, but at least somewhere mind probably it gets there, it realizes the nature, and then probably that's the first insight, or where you see the things as they are, then you maybe it's like first stage of awakening, or maybe, I don't know.
One point it's really is Lama Tsongkhapa's position in this text and other texts that he wrote is that let's see if this is right, is that when one contemplates, based on the wisdom of study, right, of listening and of study, one sort of gains some intellectual understanding of what emptiness means, and then one goes off on one's own and contemplates that, right, and thinks deeply and sort of relates it to one's own experience and reasoning. And then Lama Tsongkhapa makes this point. He makes the point that the goal of that is to develop, is develop the wisdom. So first comes the wisdom arisen from hearing or study, And then by going off and sort of thinking very deeply and relating it to one's own experience and reasoning and so on, one comes to a, a correct conceptual insight into emptiness that's still dependent on language, on thought, on analysis, on one's own, as he's describing here, right, on one's own thorough and subtle analysis. And one comes to a kind of correct conceptual insight and experience of emptiness that's conceptual. And that's actually, according to the way Lama Tsongkhapa describes it, that's a very important and valuable moment, actually, in one's practice. It helps the person humongously. And then what the person does is, through ultimately calm abiding, but through meditative concentration, one meditates on that experience, and it becomes, it's still conceptual at that point, right? But it becomes more and more refined, and more deeply experiential, and more impactful, because one is familiarizing with it. And then through that, there eventually comes an experience of a direct realization of emptiness that's non-conceptual, and that's they describe it experientially as like being like water poured into water. There's no longer any experience of subject and object. There's no longer any, and that experience, they say, is in some sense, indescribable, and because it's beyond, because it's direct. It's a direct insight, and it's non-conceptual. So it's, in a sense, that experience is in some sense beyond words. So at that point, so I just was differentiating that sort of these two different parts of the experience of realizing emptiness. But the conceptual one is actually considered a realization. Interesting. Like, whereas when one conceptually realizes emptiness, that's a realization. It's conceptual, but it's a realization. Then there's a different realization, a different experience when one directly realizes emptiness.
As you mentioned, it's like beginning of this talk that that yes, we conceptualize this, but once we aware about it, and then we see the things differently as I'm seeing you, and then not have to intellectualize like, okay, you're not real, but it just happens of its own, like you, it becomes a direct realization. So when you see things.
But and just go back to your point from earlier. So, just a couple things. That definitely, I'll just make a couple points just to make sure I said it clearly. I'm not sure. Like, so one is like, while it's true. First of all, it is true that because Lama Tsongkhapa was so sort of, he emphasized this point. So in the Gelugpa tradition, for sure, there's a kind of emphasis on emptiness is empty, emptiness is dependent. I mean, he put so much emphasis on that point that there's not inconsistency on that within the Gelugpa tradition, but there is, but it is true, because I've been reading some of that text like that, that within, say, the Nyingma tradition or the Kagyu tradition, those two in particular, like, there are some philosophers who will, whose position is quite similar to Lama Tsongkhapa's, and there are other philosophers who have a different philosophical perspective, and so it's not like that's an important point. It's not like you couldn't say like, oh, the entire Nyingma tradition has this, and then the entire Gelug. That's not true. But there are certain philosophers, and even within, like, I was reading, take the example of a more recent great Nyingma philosopher, Mipam, who's one of the most respected philosophers. I think he was a teacher of Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche when he was very young, and wrote many philosophical texts.
Was Nyingma, not Kagyu?
Oh, he was Nyingma, yeah. Nyingma.
Okay.
I mean, he was kind of non-sectarian, but mostly Nyingma. And if you look at his text, there are some texts where his position is quite close to what Lama Tsongkhapa is saying, and other texts where he his presentation of emptiness is quite different. And it depends which, and I think it's because he's commenting on, when he's commenting on one topic, like if he's teaching, he wrote many commentaries, so when he was commenting on, a certain text from India, he was explained it in one way, and when he was teaching another text, he explained it a different way, and obviously he had different reasons for explaining that to help a certain kind of practitioner, I would think, who was doing that particular practice. So like when he was teaching practitioners who would be using this text to do this practice, he explained it, using one kind of language, and then when he was explaining another text, he kind of explained it in a different way because he thought it would help the practitioner who was practicing that. So I guess my point is like, within, say in the Nyingma tradition, different philosophers within the Nyingma tradition have different positions, but even sometimes the same philosopher
Right.
on a certain text or for a certain purpose might have explained it in a slightly different way. Because in the context of that practice, I guess he thought that was more helpful to the people who were practicing that. So I was just using him as the example, and he was definitely, he was a kind of, one of the Rime, but mostly Nyingma. His texts are mostly Nyingma, in tradition. So if you ask that person, you could kind of explore that. Maybe it might help actually to sort of understand, was he basing that on a certain philosophical author or position? It might be helpful actually, because I find it actually. I'll say one more point about that. Like, I think Lama Tsongkhapa raises a lot of these points because, I'm sure for many reasons, but one is, I agree with what you're saying in the sense that it's like, if you can't, on the point of emptiness, right?
Yeah.
If you can't differentiate between, like, they make a point like even within the Indian tradition, right? There were 4 main tenet systems that explained the ultimate nature of reality in different ways, actually. The Vaibhashikas and the Sautrantrikas and the mind-only school and the middle way school. And then even within Indian philosophy, within the mind-only school, there were subsets. There was a mind-only. There were different subsets. Like Asanga taught it the mind-only a little bit differently than Kamalashila and so on. And then within the middle way school, there was slight differences of position between Chandrakirti and Baba Viveka, for example. There were 2 Indian masters. And Tibetans study that. One time I remember, like, it said in this text, I remember one time asking, like, why do they, it was like, well, if all the great Tibetan philosophers think Chandrakirti was correct, that his position was the most correct, why do people study the positions of these other teachers, like, all these other philosophical tenet systems? And I thought it was very useful practically. It was saying, like, the answer was, like, if you can't experientially and in yourself differentiate these different positions, then to say you understand Chandrakirti is silly. Like, whereas if you can't really, if you said, oh, I read Chandrakirti, I know what he means, but then if somebody were to teach you Asanga's position, now Asanga was a great bodhisattva, right? But if you can't say, well, I can really in my own experience differentiate, this was the experience Asanga's describing, and this is the experience Chandrakirti is describing, and I get the difference. And I remember that one point, I was studying like the mind-only school, and I was like, at that point I was reading it, and I was like, well, this sounds just the same as Chandrakirti, I don't get the difference. I was like, well, exactly, I don't get it, it was like, that's right, I don't get it. And so a lot of these things like that, like, so to really be able to go, what's the difference? I was doing that when I was reading, again, the Nyingma teacher, Mipam, for example. I was like going like, okay, the point where he was would disagree with Lama Tsongkhapa. I was like, if I can't understand why he disagrees and what the real experiential difference would be, then I don't understand Lama Tsongkhapa even really correct, very subtly, or, And so to me, like, these questions are quite useful because they're getting at experiences.
Or you're way ahead. Yeah, no, I think
But I think
what
your question
saying is very valuable, though.
I'm just emphasizing the benefit.
Yeah.
But I think you're asking.
I
I
agree
guess
with what you s- yeah,
I think it's great that you're asking that question.
because I'm on that level.
But you're
It's
pursuing-
just that little.
Yeah, but you're pursuing an experience, right? To say, like, what is this getting at experientially, and why is that different? Why is it important, even, right? And
Yeah.
how does that relate to something? I think it's great to ask those questions because it's how we, like. I guess one more point I'll make about that is Lama Tsongkhapa here says, right, wisdom comes about through investigation, right? And so if you're not asking questions like that, then you're not investigating, right? But if you're asking that question to me and to the other person, and you think about it, that's you doing your own investigation, which is how you get wisdom, right? And if you don't ever ask those questions, then your wisdom doesn't increase. So I think it's really good to ask those kind of questions, actually, and say like, well, why would somebody say this, and why would somebody say that, and like, how does that relate to somebody's experience of the path, and so on. That seems like the way people's wisdom develops, you know. I remember one time, like, I was in New York City hanging out after Ken Rinpoche was teaching on the front steps, and it was really fun. We were hanging out with like a whole bunch of practitioners, like we were hanging out talking, and one of the people there was Geshe Darge, who's Geshe, right, Tibetan Geshe, a good scholar, a very good scholar, and a senior, you know, he was the discipline master of Sarah Monastery, and I found this very fun. He started debating with the Western students, right, but he was taking the position that completely disagrees with like Lama Tsongkhapa's stance on what emptiness means. And I knew, I was like, he didn't say that, but I was like, oh, I know, he's taking the opposite position of the one that he usually, and it was fun to watch because like I was going, oh, he's winning though. The Westerns couldn't, like, it was like, you know, it was like he was saying if you can't beat me, you don't really understand. If you can't understand what I'm saying and explain why I'm wrong, then if you say, oh, I agree with Lama Tsongkhapa, you don't really agree with Lama Tsongkhapa because you don't know you don't really understand it well. If you can understand it well enough to defeat the position I'm taking, then you don't really understand what he's getting at. And I was like, oh, that's great, like, because he's trying to encourage investigation, right? It was like if he just said, oh, Lama Tsongkhapa said this, right, and he knows that the people there like Lama Tsongkhapa's texts, then there's like, oh, everybody go, oh, yeah, I agree with you. But I was like, oh, he's taking the opposite position to make people think more deeply, right? And like to go, well, if Lama Tsongkhapa is right, then why is he wrong? But if I can't explain why he's wrong, then I don't really understand why Lama Tsongkhapa is right on this point. I was like, that's encouraging wisdom. So asking those questions is like how we develop deeper wisdom, I think, you know. So I think it's good. I think we should stop now. But let's do the dedication. The supreme jewel bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In this snowy mountain paradise, you the source of good and happiness, all-powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara is end.
Thank you.